Hi everybody, my name is Louis Oriash, and I'm Figma's Designer Advocate for Europe. Figma is a cloud-based design tool that enables teams of 1 to 1,000 designers become successful by placing collaboration and communication front and center in the design process. And today I'm here to talk to you about design systems. They're becoming more and more popular with every business, globally. Every design team, engineering team, product team sees this as something paramount to their success. It's becoming elusive as well. Lots of people don't really know what a design system is, and I'm here to give you a little bit of advice how to get started, what they mean, and what they mean for a business that's scaling and looking to take this on. I'll be covering these 4 topics: the landscape of design systems, what does it mean, where are we, the friction. Ultimately, when we're a team of product, design, engineering, UX, copywriters, the entire business basically, there's going to be friction when it starts to think about our systems. How can we get around that? What does it mean? And what does it look like in the future? How we can scale operations. This is the big one. Operations are central to getting these things signed off, to driving them forward, and also to make sure that everybody's happy inside the business. And also, how can we set expectations? The reality is that these require a big investment, both in time and money. So how can we get started, and how can we ensure everybody is happy? First up, the landscape. As I mentioned, we need to understand what's possible, what's not possible before we start to do this. The first thing that comes up is that this is ultimately a natural requirement. When we start to see teams that are growing, expanding, we see lots of inconsistencies inside of our design, also in our engineering. And we want to consolidate these by introducing systems or component parts that can scale up. We also land at a position where users need consistency. If we want to build products that are familiar and usable, our users need to understand that what they're seeing fits inside our wider brand and is consistent at scale. We have a business need. We want to be able to measure our processes, make sure they're the same, regardless of whether it's somebody writing copy on a website or it's somebody designing an app. We want to make sure that there is that consistency and we can measure it. We need efficiency. We need to make sure that we're actually using our budget effectively, using our resources effectively, and ensuring that everybody is happy and successful inside their roles. And lastly, we want to scale. We want to make sure that we can push our designs to as many people as possible, as fast as possible, and in a consistent way as possible. So if we think about these topics, we can see a group here. We've got users and we've got businesses. But the fact is, these come and play into each other's paths very naturally. The business needs help the user, and the user need help the business. If we can cross and transfer these over, we can see success at scale in every single business. There's also the thing that investments in design are growing massively. If we look at these top companies here, we can see comparisons over time about their designers and developer ratios. Take Atlassian, for example. In 2012, they had 25 engineers to 1 designer. And in 2020, they had 5 engineers to 1 designer. This signifies the importance of the design process in scaling up your business, your product, and your offering to the market at large. And the more we do invest in systems and processes and the design process itself, the more successful we're going to become. Dropbox has 4 engineers to 1 designer now. This significant shift and reduction of engineers per designer ratio is signifying that the communication and collaboration at the center of the design process is going to ensure your success in the long run. Naming is really, really hard. We call them design systems, but personally, I don't think that does it justice. Placing design inside the name means that we're always going to be framing it from a designer's perspective. Somebody who isn't a designer naturally is going to be thinking, I don't need to be bothered with this. It doesn't make sense to me. But the reality is, it's not just for designers, or tech or engineering, or product or writing, or marketing, or sales. It actually is something that is collaborative across every single department in the business. The more we try to think about processes and systems, the more we become comfortable at scaling up our operations at scale from every department, not just design. And we can place a robust system at the center of this. And that's where we start to group these things together. Once we group our departments together, we can see a familiar trend across all the different aspects and requirements that we have for each department. Whether it's a logo, whether it's photos, whether it's copywriting, components, colors, user testing, these values, core principles, and guidelines are all central to our design system and our design system processes. Design operations is becoming a massive field at the moment, with companies all over the globe hiring design operations people at the front and center of their systems thinking. And it's linking these departments together that is going to enable us to become successful. Next up is the friction. As I mentioned, we're ultimately going to end up with friction at any stage of the business, regardless of whether we have a system or not. Friction is a natural part of every single process in the business, and having a system at the front of that can actually reduce that friction, make it a lot easier to scale. And this is where context becomes super important. Without context, no one is going to be successful. Every project will fail, and we'll be wasting money and budget. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with this drawing, where we have just two stages: draw some circles, and then draw the rest of the owl. This is providing us with no context. And without that context, we're a poorly functioning team. So what we need to understand is that that context needs to be traversed remotely. It needs to be done across departments. Remember the departments that I showed you from before? We all have different delivery schedules, whether we're working on Kanban or Agile or Scrum or Waterfall. We're all working in different schedules. We are also all having very different communication styles. If you speak to a salesperson, if you speak to a designer, if you speak to an engineer, you'll understand that you'd need to have a slightly different context when you're conversing with these people. It's not easy. So this context is super important as we start to think about scaling up our system and making sure that we can get from just a diagram of a drawing and a diagram of an owl to enabling somebody to actually pull together that art in one long process. So we think about this in terms of component parts and documentation. Placing documentation at the front of our designs and our code ensures that we can scale up. So we take things like wireframes and styles and animations and components and place these in a context and a format that is familiar for all of us and can enable all of us to scale. We start to become super successful. If we take those into a practical example, when we're building out websites or apps, whether it's in a framework like React or Angular or iOS or Android or just a web-based app, we've got all these things that need to fit into the system. We have wireframes and components and animations and copywriting and the marketing plan. And we start to think about what tooling can we use to satisfy these needs. And ultimately, the consolidation of our tools is going to allow us to succeed at scale. And this is what we firmly believe in at Figma, is how can we consolidate those tools and ensure every team can become successful at scale. If we think about the design process historically, we're thinking about things like strategy, discovery, analysis, design, and production. This works for a design team. A siloed design team can function very well like this. What we ultimately have is a system where the design and development workflow becomes siloed. And this is where we typically find the waterfall process fails us. Having development right at the end and handing off your work to your developers can actually provide more friction than it's trying to solve. And if we do put developers front and center of the design process, we can become a lot more successful as a team. Which is why I believe that providing context and placing communication and collaboration at the front and center of the design process to become more of a product process is going to enable us to become super successful as a business. So bringing in that context early for your developers is going to enable your designs to get pushed faster through that process, your developers to feel more comfortable with what you're handing over to them, and ultimately provide better products. What we ultimately want to do here is build bridges between the design and development team rather than silos. What we ultimately find is teams that don't have those bridges connecting design to development, you have these silos over here, and the work suffers. If we can speak more frequently, more often, and with the context that I've discussed before with documentation, we're going to enable us to become successful. Next up is how we scale operations. Operations are central. As I mentioned before, design operations is becoming a position that most major businesses are hiring for. How can we set up our teams for success? How can we enable our operations to scale as well, whilst keeping on budget? And this naturally lands on money, return on investment of what we're trying to do. We all have a bottom line that we need to reach, and ensuring that investing in a system can enable us to reach that bottom line or make it better is super important. So I have an example here from Deliveroo Design, and they estimate that they saved a significant amount of money from a return on investment perspective from investing in a design system. If we take a look at their web tooling, they're estimating over 300 days for engineering and 300 days for design saved by investing in a design system. In financial sense, this means that they saved over £162,000. This investment could be put back into the team, it could be put into research and development. You could take everyone to Hawaii. These sorts of things are enabling teams to save a significant amount of money on their bottom line to provide a successful experience to the user. We then have the business need and the user need working in tandem, and everybody becomes a lot happier with that process. If we look at their iOS platform in itself, just alone, engineering time saved 37 days and £12,000. This might seem more insignificant compared to the previous number, but if we think about that over time, we're starting to see significant savings year on year. They also estimated that they'd be saving a significant amount of money on a new product. So if we take a look at their Android platform here, they're saving 30 days from an engineering perspective, 18 days from a design perspective, and £12,000 as well. And iOS, that goes up to £27,000. It's expensive to build products, and the more we can save on the bottom line through these systems and processes, the more we can deliver excellent experiences to our users. So the stages of investment, I've broken them down into four individual stages, which scale up through each stage as we go through it. Stage one of our design system, when we start to think about a design system as an operation, is where we have all of our consumers, and by consumers I mean just designers or engineers, all contributing and creating, updating and publishing that work. So we have a really collaborative process at front and center. This is the lowest rung on the ladder. If we start to think about stage two, this is where you have some people who are passers-by, who aren't creating, publishing, updating components and styles. You still have that operational excellence going on where people are consuming, people are creating, and we're getting that satisfaction moving through the pipeline. We start to think about stage three. This is where we put significant investment in our design system, where we start to build out a design systems team. Having a dedicated team means that resource can ensure that things are perfect or getting towards perfect. We can have a collaboration between the designers, between the developers, to ensure that our components that we're creating are proliferated across the business, across our products, to ensure a consistent user experience. We can still have our consumers floating around our design systems team, but with that dedicated resource, we're ensuring excellence from a business perspective. Then we get to stage four. This is where we take it to the next level, where we start to think about a gold standard of design systems teams. This is where you think about international teams, multi-product teams, multi-platform teams, having independent but related design systems operating together. So you can see on the slide, we have our core design systems team operating independently. We have our brand is operating as a slice or spin-off of that design system, and we have our consumers operating independently too. This stage four requires significant investment. It requires teams, it requires management, it requires operational excellence. But this is where we all strive to be. Stage four is, as I mentioned, the gold standard. This leads us into how we set expectations. What can we actually achieve as a business? This is quite hard. We don't know where to start. We don't know what we want to do, and ultimately how we can satisfy our users. So the first thing we ultimately want to do is to define our purpose. What are we trying to achieve here? Do we want to be a stage one, or do we want to be a stage four? How much investment are we going to put into this from a time perspective? Just a few examples of what this looks like in the wild. We have the Shopify Polaris design system, dedicated team. They have a public-facing website where you can go and investigate their components, their styles, their copywriting, tone of voice guidelines. This is where a lot of companies aim to go. The Shopify Polaris system is excellent, but as I mentioned, requires a dedicated team. And of course, we have Apple's human interface guidelines. This is probably stage 5 if we're going to think about how much work this gets put into this kind of system. Apple's HIG has the benchmark for every single Apple product that goes through its platform. If you want to build an app, you need to adhere to their guidelines. If you want to build a web app, mobile app, tablet app, iOS app, it has to be on their terms. This is very prescriptive, and design systems team probably wouldn't necessarily need to go this far. But if you want to see how an international, multinational platform sets their standard, Apple is the way to go. This is what it means to become level 11 out of 10 when we start to think about documentation. So we think about levels of fidelity in here. Shopify and Apple are definitely at the top end of fidelity levels here. So if we think about what the requirement is from a stage 4 or a stage 1, and the levels of fidelity that they go to with their design system, the collaboration between the engineering and between the design and copywriting, marketing, etc. is tight and it's locked down. And they have those dedicated teams putting in the effort and resources to make that a reality. If we shift gears slightly to think about Figma itself, our design system isn't fully baked as those two examples. We have a style guide, we have components, we have styles, we have colors, typography, all this sorts of thing. But we haven't found a need to take it up to that next level because we're operating in a way that makes sense for us. The iterative nature of design tooling and our product itself means that we're happy with what we have, and the libraries and the UI kits that we do employ make sense. So we start to think about the fidelity of something like Figma's design system. We're down about stage 2. And this might be a surprise or it might be a shock because we are leading the design tooling. But as I said before, we need to define what makes sense for us and the investment that makes sense for us as a business. So bottom line is the levels of fidelity are determined by how much investment you want to put into that. Do you want to employ people? Do you want to build out teams? Do you want to scale internationally? Or do you want to have a system more like Figma's, where it makes sense at a lower scale? This ultimately determines the investment you're going to put in from financial perspective, from a team and hiring perspective, also the dedicated resources you want to be placing on top of this. Every scaling business that wants to have international, multi-language, multi-product design systems needs to be aiming for the level 4. But a smaller operation that maybe spins off a company or has a separate product in a separate language that has a different style guide can definitely aim for something like a level 2, which requires a lot less investment. So we need to ultimately ask ourselves, do we want to be a Shopify Polaris or do we want to be a Figma UI2? And having those two anchors in our mind allows us to sit on that scale of fidelity to determine what we want to achieve. And just some parting thoughts about how we can scale this up ourselves and the goals that we can have as a business. In order to have success with a robust design system, we ultimately want to consolidate and collaborate. Consolidating all of our assets, our components, our styles across different brands, across different languages, across different international entities. And consolidating them requires communication and collaboration at the front and center. Without communication and collaboration, no design process is going to be successful. So unless we get there, we can't then begin to consolidate. Once we employ this system, we also can enable efficiency and scalability. We can launch a new brand very quickly. We can launch a new product very quickly because we have the base guidelines and the base standards already set up for us. Having that system employed means that we can do these things very, very quickly. And ensuring documentation is front and center can enable us to become successful a lot more quickly as well. Almost more importantly, we have consumer consistency. The users can expect consistent appearance and experience when they're using your products. The gold standard here for me really is something like the BBC. Whether you're using their sports app, their news app, their website, their iOS product, their Android product, you can feel it's the BBC's product. And that's because they have robust systems at the heart of this. It's investing significantly in those teams to ensure that the user experience is consistent, scalable across their platforms and across languages and across nations. And lastly, cost savings. Super important for a business to be thinking about the bottom line. And if we can consistently cut costs on our teams and how much money we're spending supporting building systems and products, everyone's going to be happy. Thank you very much.